I want you all to know that I am so honored to be able to make this introduction. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Linda Garnett. Linda Garnett, who got her PhD from the University of Michigan, is a psychotherapist and organizational consultant specializing in non-profit social purpose organizations and lesbian, gay, and bisexual clients. And is also an adjunct professor in the Department of Psychology, Women's Studies, and Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Since 1987, she has taught a course that she created called The Psychology of the Lesbian Experience. She is nationally known for her publications and presentations on lesbian and gay psychology, including a co-edited anthology titled Psychological Perspectives on Lesbian and Gay Male Experiences, and a co-edited special issue of the Journal of Social Issues on Women's Sexualities, Perspectives on Sexual Orientation and Gender. Dr. Garnett also was co-author and co-presenter of an American Psychological Association invited master lecture in 1990 on lesbian and gay male dimensions in the psychological study of human diversity that was published by APA in Psychological Studies in Human Diversity in America. Dr. Garnett is well honored. She is a recipient of the Distinguished Professional Contribution Award from Division 44 and the Outstanding Contribution Award from the Committee on Lesbian, Gay, and Bisexual Concerns and UCLA's Outstanding LGBT Faculty Award. And I know that there are lots of other awards on her vita. If you want to look at it, just come and get it from me. She is a fellow of the American Psychological Association. She's worked on many boards and committees in APA. She was chair of the American Psychological Association's Board for the Advancement of Psychology in the Public Interest, fondly known as BAPI, and of APA's Committee on Lesbian, Gay, and Bisexual Concerns. As co-chair of the Committee on Lesbian and Gay Bisexual Task Force on Bias and Psychotherapy with Lesbians and Gay Men, she co-authored the final report of the task force, which was published in the American Psychologist. One of the things that I did in looking at Dr. Garnett's vita was to look at the number of times the words hate crimes and violence was used. Those words were used in over a dozen titles in those publications and presentations. And I just think it's significant of where we are in this world with a whole group of people that we like to marginalize and like to pretend don't even exist. And so today, to help us and to help the American Psychological Association make a profound change, let's welcome to the podium Dr. Linda Garnett.
At least you know one lesbian exists. First, I really want to thank you all for coming out to hear my talk. You know, in thinking about speaking at a summit about diversity, I was reminded of a story that a good friend told me. Barbara is a wealthy white WASP woman who had been with her partner, Lisa, for several years. Lisa comes from a poor family and is African American. Barbara had told her mother about their relationship, but the conversation had never gone very far because her mother was too upset to talk about it. Finally, Barbara had it. She invited her mother to lunch, and she asked her mother, "Mom, is it the class thing?" "No." "Is it the black thing?" "No." "Then what is it?" "It's the woman thing," which is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to put sexual orientations into perspective today. And as this story reminds us, and as Rosie just reminded us, sexual orientation is so powerful and so stigmatized. Also, I want to just acknowledge my colleague Ann Peplau, who's putting up all the overheads. And I just hope you know that actually I cannot think straight, so therefore I made slides that have no straight lines on them, just for your clarification. And lavender's our color, so I wanted you to know where we're coming from. My talk today focuses on a new conceptual framework that helps us to understand the complexity of human sexual, affectional, and erotic attractions, commonly known as sexual orientation. I will be drawing on the growing base of scientific evidence conducted in many fields over the past 30 years. If you could see the hundreds of pages of references that I have cited in my paper, you'd see that my comments are based on state-of-the-art research findings. There are two sources that document well the ideas that I'm presenting, and so if you're interested, here they are. In my talk, I will use plural terms such as sexualities and sexual orientations to signal the importance of encompassing the full range of people's desire, loves, and relationships. In addition, throughout my talk, I will sometimes use LGB, which is a shorthand for lesbian, gay, bisexual. Specifically, I will emphasize 4 themes: conceptualization of sexual orientations, the development of sexual orientations, new perspectives on gender and sexual orientation, and convergence, divergence, and intersections of sexual orientations with other aspects of human diversity. Many of the features of this new paradigm presented in my talk were developed in collaboration with Ann Peplau and Douglas Kimmel. To Jacqueline Goodchild and Martha Banal, I would like to express my gratitude for serving as my role models and mentors. And to my life partner of over 20 years, Barry Levy, my deepest gratitude and love to my most enthusiastic supporter. Enough with the schmaltz, here I go. How should sexual orientations be conceptualized? An old paradigm put people into rigid categories of heterosexual versus homosexual. In contrast, scientific research points to a new, continuous, multidimensional conceptualization of sexual orientation. 4 features of the old and new paradigms highlight how the new paradigm advances our understanding. On the list that you're seeing, these are all the new paradigm. I figured you already knew the old ones. First, the old paradigm assumed that individuals can be readily categorized as heterosexual or homosexual. In other words, it viewed sexual orientation as a bipolar construct that exists in only 2 opposite discrete categories. In fact, human experience rarely fits either or categories. For example, the old paradigm either ignored or denied the existence of bisexuality or viewed bisexuality as a transitory or transitional state. As one bisexual man expressed it, "I'm just simply trying to live a both-and life in an either-or world." In contrast, the new paradigm conceptualizes sexual orientations along a continuum, similar to a spectrum of colors as in a rainbow. Sexual orientation reflects the diversity of sexual, affectional, and erotic attractions and love towards persons of the same gender, other gender, or both genders. Attraction to females and attraction to males represent 2 separate and independent dimensions. An individual's sexual orientation reflects the combination of his or her location on each of these dimensions. This model makes it possible to view bisexuality as an identity. Second, the old paradigm assumed that sexual behavior is the defining feature of a person's sexual orientation. In contrast, research has found that sexual orientations encompass multiple dimensions in addition to sexual behavior. These include erotic and affectional behaviors and fantasies, emotional attachments, self-identification, and current relationship status. In fact, sexual behavior by itself is not always a good indicator of a person's sexual orientation. Sexual orientations are viewed as diverse, with each individual having a distinctive combination of erotic and affectional feelings, fantasies, activities, and relationships that is unique as a fingerprint or a voice print. Money termed this template a love map. Third, the old paradigm assumed that there is congruence among sexual identity, behavior, and desire. Some individuals do report consistency. A woman might identify as lesbian, be attracted exclusively to women, and have sex. See, sex gets me caught here. And be sex partners with women only. However, research has shown that sexual activity, fantasy, and identity are not always congruent. Exceptions are common. For example, a woman who identifies as bisexual might never develop a strong attraction to a man. A woman may identify as lesbian or bisexual, but not engage in same-gender sexual behavior. A man who identifies as gay might have been married and had a strong attraction to a woman. A heterosexual man may employ homoerotic fantasies when having sex with his female partner. Or an individual may engage in sexual acts or have sexual desires without self-identifying as a member of a particular sexual orientation. In fact, many more people engage in same-gender sexual behavior than identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. Fourth, the old paradigm asserted that sexual orientation is an enduring disposition that forms at an early age and is then fixed and unchanging. New empirical findings present a very different picture. Sexual development appears to be potentially fluid and changeable over time. Its patterns varies across social contexts and cultures. Identification as bisexual, gay, lesbian, or heterosexual and actual behavior can vary over time. It may not be the same at age 15, 25, 45, or 70. I have to hold myself back by saying, hike, you know. There is considerable evidence, for example, that non-exclusive attractions towards both women and men change over time and characterize the experience of some men and women who may or may not call themselves bisexual. For example, women who have had exclusively heterosexual experiences may develop an attraction to other women at any time in their lives, and vice versa. Such fluidity is more characteristic of women than men. It is important to emphasize that the capacity for erotic fluidity does not mean that most men or most women will actually exhibit significant change over time. So don't worry. The key point, I know you're getting a little sweaty right now. The key point is that some people experience variation and change in their love map. Now we're going to turn to the development of sexual orientations. Until recently, those interested in the development of sexual orientation asked why some people become gay or lesbian. Today's new paradigm expands this question to ask what leads all of us, heterosexual as well as LGBs, to form a particular sexual orientation. I will discuss 4 themes to respond to this: biological antecedents, childhood antecedents, multiple causal factors and multiple pathways, and sexual prejudice. What role do biological factors play in determining whether a woman or a man is heterosexual, lesbian, gay, or bisexual? First, despite the popularity of ideas about gay brains and gay genes, the actual scientific evidence for biological factors in humans is quite limited and generally has been based only on studies of men. For example, consider the work attempting to identify differences in brain structures between heterosexuals and homosexuals. To date, this research is based on a total of 4 studies, each with different findings and all studying gay men. This research has been widely reported in the popular press as the discovery of a gay brain. In the scientific community, however, the replicability of these findings has been questioned and their interpretations remain controversial. This fact alone should warrant caution in placing too much weight on biological influences for individuals. Second, there are possible sex differences in potential biological influences. Current findings suggest that male homosexuality may be more strongly linked to genetic or other biological determinants. As one of many possible examples, there is some evidence of a potential genetic linkage for sexual orientation in men, but not in women. Available evidence suggests that biological factors play only a minor and indirect role in the development of women's sexual orientation, and it is therefore unwise to generalize from the male to the female situation. It's always unwise to do that. A third important point is that most scientists now agree that human behavior invariably reflects both biological and environmental or experiential factors. In other words, there is no biological influence, be it a gene or prenatal hormones, that flips a switch and changes an individual's sexual orientation from heterosexual to homosexual. So, whatever possible influence hormones and genes may have on the development of human sexual orientation, they will invariably be indirect and strongly influenced by the social environment. Now let's turn to childhood antecedents of sexual orientations. It is often believed that sexual orientation is strongly influenced by childhood experiences. Empirical research has not supported this view. Efforts to verify psychoanalytic theories about the family history antecedents of sexual orientation have failed. Furthermore, the sexual orientation of parents appears to have little impact on the sexual orientation of their children. Most lesbians and gay men were raised by heterosexual parents, and most children raised by gay or lesbian parents become heterosexual adults. As with biological antecedents, childhood experiences appear to have stronger and more lasting effects on male than female homosexuality. Not sexuality, sexuality. For example, the correlation between adult sexual orientation and retrospective reports of childhood gender nonconformity is significantly higher among men than among women. Moreover, available research has so far failed to identify events or activities that predictably point a girl in our culture on the path towards lesbian or bisexual attractions. Finally, the new paradigm emphasizes the sexual orientation is multiply determined. Although some might appreciate, I know we do, the simplicity of identifying the gay gene or a single formative experience that leads one person to be heterosexual and another to be LGBT, reality is far more complex. Recent research suggests sexual orientation is multiply determined by many influences. No single factor reliably predicts whether a man or a woman will embark on a path towards heterosexuality, homosexuality, or bisexuality, or some other pattern. For example, some youthful tomboys who liked so-called masculine games and activities grew up to become lesbians, but many more became heterosexuals. Some gender nonconforming boys grow up to be bisexual or heterosexual. Many may remain gender nonconforming men as adults. In addition, there are multiple developmental pathways that lead to similar outcomes. Just as people become psychologists through multiple pathways and for diverse personal reasons, so too people may adopt their sexual orientations and identities through different developmental trajectories. Also, men and women may be drawn to particular orientations and identities for differing reasons. Knowing how someone labels their sexual identity does not necessarily inform us about the patterns of their life experiences or the nature of their current erotic behavior, thought, and feelings. This pattern shift in conceptualizing sexual development views the development of sexual identities as diverse and complex. Instead of a single step-by-step sequence, development may be nonlinear. This view is in sharp contrast to stage models that hypothesized a linear process involving a specific sequence of steps moving toward the establishment of a stable identity as lesbian or gay. Research has found that many individuals do not follow the steps outlined in these models. For example, Diamond has been conducting a prospective longitudinal study of sexual attractions, behaviors, and identities of sexual minority youth. Over a 2-year period, nearly 40% of participants reported having undergone changes in their sexual attractions that they did not attribute to changes in awareness. Further, 50% of the young women had changed their identity label more than once since first relinquishing their heterosexual identity. The new paradigm recognizes the highly individualized and personal process of arriving at a sexual identity for each one of us. Sexual prejudice. The developmental experiences of LGBT individuals must be understood in the context of widespread prejudice against sexual minorities in our society. Sexual prejudice, according to Greg Herrick, refers to negative attitudes towards an individual because of his or her sexual orientation. It is used to characterize heterosexuals' negative attitudes towards homosexual behavior, people with a homosexual or bisexual orientation, and communities of gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. A related concept that is coming up is heterosexism, which refers to the belief that heterosexuality is the only acceptable sexual orientation. You all remember this. For every girl, there is a boy. Now, trust me, if I was told as a young child, for every girl, there's a girl or a boy, it wouldn't have taken me 8 years to come out as a lesbian. And for bisexuals, for any girl, there's a girl and a boy, and a girl and a boy. What do I know? Any non-heterosexual form of behavior, identity, relationship, or community is denied, denigrated, and stigmatized. Heterosexism serves to legitimize both individual and institutional prejudice and discrimination. For example, a very close friend of mine was dying, and the hospital would only let her partner of 12 years see her when she pretended to be her sister. She was not considered immediate family by the hospital's visitation rules. Bisexual men and women often encounter negative attitudes from both heterosexuals and homosexuals, a form of prejudice called monosexism. Examples include the belief that bisexuality does not exist, that bisexuals are promiscuous, and the pressure that bisexuals experience to identify as either heterosexual or gay lesbian. On the one hand, they may be seen as trying to avoid the stigma of being homosexual. On the other hand, they may be viewed as being less trustworthy than a real heterosexual. Now I'm going to turn to new perspectives on gender and sexual orientations. A growing body of research on gender and sexuality has contributed to new perspectives on sexual orientation. I will highlight two major changes. First, the primacy of gender over sexual orientation in understanding women's and men's erotic and romantic desires. And second, the challenges of bisexuality. Does it really enhance our understanding to view lesbians primarily as homosexuals and hence like gay men, or to consider lesbians first and foremost as women and hence like heterosexual women? A long-standing presumption has been that most The most important thing about LGBs is their atypical sexual orientation. Hence, to assume that lesbians, gay men, and bisexuals are similar in many ways. While LGBs are affected by both their gender and their sexual orientation, empirical findings strongly suggest that the patterns of sexual thoughts, behaviors, and attractions appear to be strongly linked to gender, but not to sexual orientation. For example, gay men and lesbians bring to love relationships many of the same expectations, values, and interests as heterosexuals of the same gender. These similarities among men and similarities among women are currently recognized as based on some combination of biology, gender socialization, and social status. So, regardless of sexual orientation, there are gender differences between the sexualities of women and men. For example, girls and women tend to have a relational or partner-centered orientation to sexuality, and boys and men tend to have a recreational or body-centered orientation. For example, Regan and Rashad asked young heterosexual adults, "What is sexual desire?" These comments are illustrative. Man, sexual desire is wanting someone in a physical manner. No strings attached, just for uninhibited sexual intercourse. Woman, sexual desire is the longing to be emotionally intimate and to express love for another person. Of course, not everyone fits exclusively into their gender patterns all the time, as Barry could certainly attest. Anyway, let me go on. We're having fun yet? Just tell me that. All right. I'd like to highlight a few other research examples. Men report that they want sexual variety and partner initiative and emphasize physical gratification as the goal of sex. In contrast, women report wanting intimacy from their sexual encounters. In terms of sexual behavior, males report greater number of sex partners than do females. Women tend to have a less permissive attitude about casual sex than men. Women's sexual fantasies are more likely to include a familiar partner, affection and commitment, and to describe the setting for their sexual encounters. In contrast, men's fantasies are more likely to involve strangers, anonymous partners, or multiple partners. These data indicate that gender appears to be more powerful than sexual orientation in influencing men's and women's sexualities. Now, the challenges of bisexuality. What are the implications of bisexual existence and experience on core assumptions held about sexual orientation and gender? First, bisexuality challenges the either-or assumption that sexual orientation comes in only two mutually exclusive categories. Recent research has documented the existence of bisexuals and examined the diverse ways that the bisexual men and women construct their sexual identity and relationships. This in turn has shown that sexual orientation is not reducible to bipolar dichotomies. There is instead increasing knowledge that the concept of sexual orientation is flexible, complex, and multidimensional. Second, data about bisexual men and women challenge the old view that gender is the primary criterion for selecting a sexual or romantic partner. The findings suggest that bisexuals seem to be less restricted by gender in their sexual and affectional attraction than heterosexuals, gay men, or lesbians. They appear to attend more to characteristics of the person than to his or her gender. One woman describes it this way: "I've tried to define myself using labels of lesbian, straight, bisexual, and I didn't feel like any of them were mine. I think of it in terms of people I could love, not sexes I could love." The central point is that for many people, bisexuality is not a combination of attractions to women and men, but rather an attraction to individuals regardless of their gender. In other words, neither biological sex nor socially defined gender are necessarily the basis for attraction to a partner. This is my favorite example of the day. A bisexual woman currently in a monogamous relationship with another woman explained that, quote, "My sexual orientation is toward creative people of color who can cook." I'd like to meet her. There are many other dimensions, therefore, along which the sexual activity of one person can be differentiated from that of another besides the gender of object choice. Third, bisexuality highlights the problems inherent in narrow and rigid societal dichotomous definitions of gender. Just what does it mean to be a man or to be a woman? Some people view their own gender as defying simplistic bimodal categories of male versus female and masculine versus feminine. Transgendered is a broad term used today to describe the continuum of individuals whose gender identity and gendered behavior does not correspond with their biological sex. As one woman explains, "Some of us who have been raised as women may choose to dress in ways that men customarily dress. We may cut our hair very short. We may bind our breasts or take male hormones. Some of us live our public lives as women and our private lives as men." What's one of them calling right now? Or vice versa. It is important to emphasize that there is no inherent connection between being transgendered and sexual orientation. Transgendered people may be gay, bisexual, or heterosexual, or attracted primarily to other transgendered persons. Today, a movement among transgendered individuals is working to redefine their experience as a form of gender nonconformity rather than a form of psychopathology. In finding a better framework for thinking about gender, it is important to look at how other cultures have incorporated gender diversity into their traditions. Native American notions of sexuality and gender, for example, tend to be conceptualized very differently than Euro-American ones. Tafoya reports that of the approximately 250 native languages still spoken in the United States, at least 168 have been identified as having terms for people who are not considered male or female. These cross-gender individuals are often viewed as blessed, possessing both a male and female spirited. Yep, I went ahead of myself. Possessing both male and female spirited, as two-spirited. The role is one of spiritual social identity, not a psychosexual identity. Tafoya suggests that a useful way to compare these views would, quote, "to see European concepts of gender and sexuality as being bipolar opposites or different ends of the same string. One is either or, male or female, gay or straight. Native American concepts usually prefer circles to lines. If one takes the line of male-female, gay-straight, and bends it into a circle, there are an infinite number of possibilities. Just so, there are theoretically an infinite number of possible points of gender and sexual orientation for an individual that can shift and differ over time and location. The concept of two-spirited people among some Native Americans is an excellent example of ways other cultures can provide models of gender diversity that may be more useful than the dominant Western models. I will now discuss the convergence, divergence, and intersections, we can recognize those terms, with sexual orientation and other aspects of human diversity. As a stigmatized minority group, LGBTs have something, share certain elements in common with other minority groups. I begin by considering some of these convergences. Consider a story told by Sheila Kuehl, the first openly gay or lesbian California state assemblywoman. Sitting in a restaurant while on the campaign trail, she was approached by a constituent who said that while he viewed most politicians as liars, he knew she could be trusted. Sheila said, "Me? Why me?" He replied, Well, you've already told us the worst thing about yourself. Why would you lie about anything else? The worst thing, of course, was that Sheila's a lesbian. But the true worst thing is the damage wrought by sexual prejudice. 5 important issues affect not only LGBT persons, but also individuals from many other social groups, including racial and ethnic minorities, individuals from different class backgrounds, women, and those with disabilities. Let's talk about stereotypes. Individuals from all these groups confront stereotypes based on gender membership. For example, just as stereotypes have often depicted racial minorities as hypersexual breeders, so too stereotypes of homosexuals have often also emphasized sexuality. In the public eye, homosexuals are first and foremost interested in sex rather than love or commitment. I wish it was true, sorry. The stereotype is particularly negative about gay men who are seen as constantly on the cruise, trying to prey on children and straight men. A second parallel is discrimination and the substantial barriers that it creates to equal opportunities and resources for members of minority groups. Just as ethnic minorities have faced discrimination in employment and housing, so have LGBTs. Just as laws once prevented marriages that crossed racial lines, today gays and lesbians are prevented from marrying partners deemed to be of the, quote, wrong sex. Likewise, discrimination against sexual minorities may mean that we lose our jobs, lose custody of our children, face eviction from our homes, and are alienated from and rejected by our families, friends, and co-workers. Federal civil rights laws do not apply to sexual orientation, so that sexual minorities are not a protected category against discrimination. A third parallel is one that Rosie referred to, that members of these groups are vulnerable to acts of hostility and violence. These may range from the daily hassles of hearing jokes or derogatory names to extreme acts of personal violence and hate crimes. Reports of hate crimes based on race, ethnicity, immigrant status, gender, and sexual orientation have increased dramatically in recent years. In some measure, these acts of hatred reflect societal attitudes that tolerate or encourage group antagonisms. A fourth parallel concerns identity development. In order to form a positive identity, individuals from each minority group must assess, confront, and reject the negative, devalued identity reinforced by society and transform it into a positive and viable identity. As a result, LGBTs, like other minority groups, have developed strategies to manage their differences from the mainstream and to respond to overt and covert oppression. A final parallel is that sexual minorities, like other minorities, develop group solidarity among their members based on shared experiences and committed to working toward the elimination of prejudice and discrimination. As a member of groups, they have worked together to form social networks and communities to facilitate group identity. For example, there are parallels between the efforts of African American leaders to foster Black pride and Black is beautiful, and efforts by lesbian, gay, and bisexual activists to foster LGBT pride and gay is good, and to hold annual National LGBT Pride and National Coming Out Day events. While there are many parallels between sexual orientation and other aspects of human diversity, there are also distinctive challenges for gay men, lesbians, and bisexuals. First, LGBTs continually confront decisions about whether to reveal or conceal their identity. We call it to tell or not to tell. Second, sexual orientation is an achieved identity that is not recognized or acknowledged at birth, but rather is generally recognized only in adolescence or adulthood. This is in contrast to other minority groups who have an ascribed status that is recognized and acknowledged from birth. Third, families of LGBTs typically are heterosexual. They thus generally do not provide useful role models for normal transitions and developmental periods of LGBT individual lives. Moreover, family disruption frequently results when a gay, lesbian, or bisexual sexual orientation is revealed. Finally, in contrast to other minority groups, there is the potential for permeability of the boundaries separating heterosexuals from LGBs. For example, heterosexuals cannot be unequivocally assured that they will never feel romantic or sexual desire for a person of the same sex. The research that I have been discussing throughout this talk has shown that everyone is not 100% heterosexual all of the time. Therefore, heterosexuals may, or fear they may, explore same-gender sexual fantasies and engage in same-gender behavior at some point in their lives. This complex reality about a person's unique sexual desires, feelings, and behaviors heightens fear and prejudice towards sexual minorities. In describing these unique characteristics of sexual minorities, it reminds us that every minority group has its own distinctive challenges. I'll now turn to intersections of sexual orientations and other aspects of human diversity. For analytic purposes, we often separate the experiences of sexual minorities and people of color, the old and the young, those with who are physically able and those who are physically challenged, and so on. But in reality, each individual occupies a unique life space that locates him or her on all of these dimensions of human diversity. A lesbian may also be African American, highly educated, and elderly. A gay man may also be biracial and blind. Why is the examination of intersections across diverse groups so important? The realities of human lives involves interconnections among the individual's various multiple identities. Because of the powerful influence of minority status on daily life, intersections among minority statuses are especially important. No single element of identity, be it class, race, disability, gender, or sexual orientation, can truly be understood except in relation to the other. When individuals are forced to separate these aspects of themselves from one another, they experience a sense of alienation. Audre Lorde phrased it well. As a black lesbian feminist, comfortable with the many different ingredients of my identity, and a woman committed to racial and sexual freedom from oppression, I find I am constantly being encouraged to pluck some one aspect of myself and present this as the meaningful whole, eclipsing or denying other aspects of myself. This comment reminds us that there is a need for a model of sexual orientation based on multiplicity, not sameness, which examines the overlapping identities and statuses of culture, gender, age, race, ethnicity, class, disability, and sexuality. Did she already do it? She already did it. Hey. To illustrate this important point, I will briefly consider these three issues: socio-cultural influences on sexual orientation, the relationship between sexual minority status and heterosexual majority, and the intersection of sexual orientation and race ethnicity. It is all too easy for the public and psychologists to ignore the many powerful ways that cultural and historical factors influence sexual orientations. Although passion and sexual desire are experienced as intensely personal and unique, they are in fact shaped by, why don't I have faith in Anne all of a sudden? By cultural beliefs about gender and sexuality, by kinship systems, by men and women's economic and social status, by whether or not sexual identities are recognized in a given culture, and by attitudes of acceptance versus rejection towards sexual minorities. For example, in some cultures, same-sexual attachments are socially approved and widespread. Elsewhere, they are stigmatized and hidden. In some settings, same-gender relationships for women coexist with heterosexual marriage. In other settings, women are more likely to form exclusive relationships with either a same-gender or other gender partner. Elements assumed by American psychologists to be basic to the nature of sexual orientation may be really unique to our culture and not necessarily related to sexual orientation in other social contexts. it's very important to recognize that the stigma of homosexuality harms each of us, regardless of our sexual orientation. Let me offer 2 examples. First, there are strong cultural pressures toward heterosexuality based on fears of being labeled gay. Research has shown, for example, how sexual prejudice is used to put pressure on teenage girls to adopt traditional gender roles and to become heterosexual adults. As Hyde and Jaffe explain, all 4 sources of cultural influence, peers, parents, the media, and the schools, shape girls into heterosexual adults through 3 processes. A, displaying overtly anti-gay or homophobic attitudes, leading adolescents to believe that homosexuality is wrong, disgusting, and abnormal. B, making homosexuality and homosexual persons invisible. And C, encouraging traditional gender roles, a strong component of which is heterosexuality. So these social pressures are aimed at ensuring heterosexual adults and thereby limiting the rich range of sexualities and sexual orientations possible for any individual. Second, heterosexuals may experience social pressure to conform to traditional gender roles in order to avoid the stigmatizing label of homosexuality. Regardless of their sexual orientation, women and men who manifest characteristics inconsistent with those culturally prescribed for their gender are likely to be labeled as gay. For example, girls and women who seem to be masculine in their appearance or interests, who resist a man's sexual advances, who work in non-traditional occupations, who fight for the rights as a woman, or who appear assertive, risk being called lesbians. Because of more restricted gender role socialization of boys, this influence appears to be especially strong for men. For example, attempts to avoid the stigma of being labeled LGB inhibits heterosexual men's ability to form close, intimate relationships with members of their own gender. So, there is a high cost to society for the restrictive constraints of heterosexist bias that limits behavior to rigid gender roles, requires 100% heterosexuality, and defines one's value as a man or woman by one's rejection of homosexuality. There is a cost to society as well for the anti-sexual ideology that taints condom use, sex education, surveys of sexual behavior, and same-gender sexual relations with a broad brush of condemnation. Freedom from the constraints caused by sexual prejudice may also affect sexism and racism as we acknowledge our multicultural diversity and relish the richness it provides. Now to the intersection of sexual orientations and race ethnicity. The experience of LGBTs of color often differ from Anglo experiences. The process of forming multiple identities, for example, Asian American, female, and bisexual, involves reconciling one's ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation, as well as other identities. The challenge for LGBT people of color is to integrate multiple identities, each of which can be disparaged and can result in social disadvantage. I will explore 2 themes that illuminate this intersection of sexual orientation and ethnicity. Challenges for LGBT persons, ties to their racial ethnic communities, and managing conflicting allegiances among different communities. It is important to remember that ethnic racial minorities are highly heterogeneous. I told you I wouldn't do it. Whatever that word is, I really can never get the accent right, but you know what I mean. Very diverse, as well as multidimensional. Barry practiced me, told me where to put the accent, can't do it. It's just so, it's so diverse, I can't do it. In terms of their cultural beliefs and practices, education, socioeconomic status, and generation of migration in particular can lead to important variations in cultural beliefs. It would be inaccurate to generalize from the examples that I will use and have been using to all racial ethnic minority individuals and cultures. Moreover, ethnicity is relevant to the identities of many white people. Not all white Americans are Anglo-Saxon Protestants or espouse the values of the dominant group. As Cornel West said it well, there's something called whiteness that was constructed that hides and conceals a very rich multiculturalism among brothers and sisters of European descent in America. For example, white people who are also members of ethnic groups that are less tolerant of lesbian and gay sexual orientations are less likely to be out and therefore less visible. Our first important theme is that racial ethnic communities and extended families often serve as the primary reference group, providing social support and social networks for their members. When a person of color discloses a gay, lesbian, or bisexual identity to their family, they risk several types of criticism. Like other LGBs, they risk being rejected. I will try this again. They may be criticized for rejecting the path of heterosexuality expected by their family. But in addition, they may be viewed as selfishly placing personal desires above the needs of their own ethnic communities. A LGB identity may be perceived as a betrayal of one's own people, a loss of connection with one's own heritage, a public statement about something that reflects badly on one's culture or religion, a violation of gender role expectations of the culture, or a sign of assimilation into white mainstream culture. As an African-American lesbian explained, the family is very contradictory to us. There are emotional involvements, there are ties, the roots that it represents for all of us as individuals in a fundamentally racist, sexist society. That's why black people may decide not to come out as a lesbian or gay, for fear of being rejected by a group of people whom you not only love, but who represent a real source of security and foundation. A second theme is that racial ethnic minorities must participate in divergent social worlds, balancing demands and crossing boundaries of different groups, including the LGB communities, one's own racial and ethnic group, and the majority culture. Individuals with double and triple minority status may experience discrimination and prejudice as outsiders in each of these communities. This may be especially acute for recent immigrants and their families. As one Greek-American woman describes it, "There's a part of me that likes being different, unique, and special. But what's difficult is not to fit in anywhere, not as a Greek single parent or a lesbian single parent. Most lesbians who are moms are in couples. My sense of self is constantly from within. I don't get the benefit of either community." This is also true for sexual minority people with disabilities. They face being seen as outsiders and defective by the mainstream society, isolated from and rejected by the disabled community, and excluded by the LGB communities. Another example of managing allegiances, conflicting allegiances, occurs in the experiences of ethnic, racial, minority bisexuals. On the one hand, this process appears to be more challenging for racial or ethnic bisexuals than for lesbians and gay men, because bisexuals are a political and social minority within the gay and lesbian community. On the other hand, as Russ points out, and I quote, "Many bisexuals of mixed race or ethnicity feel a comfortable resonance between their mixed heritage and their bisexuality. In a society where both racial, ethnic, and sexual categories are highly elaborated, individuals of mixed heritage or who are bisexual find themselves straddling categories that are socially constructed as distinct from one another," unquote. As one Asian European woman explained it, "Being multiracial, multicultural has always made me aware of non-bipolar thinking. I have always been outside people's categories, and so it wasn't such a big leap to come out as bi. After spending years explaining my racial and cultural identity rather than attaching a single label to it." We can turn off the slide, and here comes the conclusion. The discussion of intersections implies a charge to all of us here today. Psychologists who focus their research and practice on the lives of sexual minorities must incorporate other forms of diversity into our research, theoretical analyses, teaching, and practice. Similarly, it is essential that you who focus your research and practice on other areas of diversity understand how sexual orientation fits into your work. No single element of identity, be it race, ethnicity, class, disability, gender, or sexual orientation, can truly be understood except in relation to the others. We must use models that are based on multiplicity, not sameness. For example, cultural beliefs influence sexual orientation. Multiple minority status exponentially increases the experience of stigma. And integrating multiple identities are important developmental and social tasks. We all need to open our minds to individuals' multiple identities and the full range of diversity. To conclude my talk today, I'd like to leave you all with a challenge. So 2 challenges, what can I say? How can you integrate this new paradigm of complex and multidimensional sexual orientations that I have presented today into your work? This requires that each of us change our outmoded notions. There is great diversity among sexual orientations, erotic and emotional attractions, behaviors, and identities, and they have complex interrelations among them. Sexual orientation is determined by multiple influences, including a wide range of social, cultural factors. The development of sexual orientation is arrived at through multiple pathways. The reality of the complexity and multidimensionality challenges oversimplified explanations that have fed and been fed by prejudice. This is an exciting challenge for us and for social forces that resist change. Based on this new body of knowledge, we must undo damaging, erroneous beliefs. This will ultimately be liberating for all of us. Thank you. Really, thank you.
I'm going to allow at least 2 questions, even though I didn't manage time well, but that's okay. So let's just go ahead and take at least 2 questions if there are 2 out there. Okay.
You can use the mic, because then everyone will hear you.
As a clinician, I've seen monosexism as almost more damaging than heterosexism. And do you have any ideas about countering that? Because that seems to be such a pervasive stereotype within gay and lesbian culture as well as heterosexual culture.
It's an excellent question. Monosexism is incredibly damaging. People get it from both. They're not accepted in the heterosexual community. They're not accepted in the gay lesbian community. As I described to you, gay lesbian people think that's just a phase until they really join us. Heterosexual people feel they're tainted with the stigma of homosexuality. It is absolutely true that that's why it's described. It is a political and social group that is actually stigmatized in all of those ways. And it is also true that gay and lesbian psychology and affirmative psychology has been advanced in the 70s and 80s, and it has part of the answer to your question is because it took us to the 80s for anyone to believe there was such an identity as bisexuality. So we first had to have bisexuals exist and constantly assert their existence as bisexuals, as well as then once we did that, to begin to educate people that it's not people's fantasies of simultaneous sexual encounters, but rather the rich diversity that I described.
Okay. Oh, one more. Okay. You get to be lucky and have a question.
Thank you. I have a quick question. What is your experience in terms of the level of prejudice among the gay and lesbian population versus other, specifically the majority level of population, which of course I'm more familiar with, and I see all kinds of prejudices. Do you find that you deal with a multiplicity of prejudices with them, as well as with what one might consider just a straight person? Does the question make sense?
Well, I'll answer it as I understand it.
Yeah.
Which may be a little different than you're saying, and if it is, tell me. One of the things, I had to cut out, you wouldn't believe how many pages are on the cutting room floor, as they say. One other thing I had wanted to talk about is that and this is true certainly for racial and ethnic minorities, for example, that within our lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community, we still have our hierarchies of privilege. And so, for example, it's a primarily Anglo LGBT community, and many people of color who are from LGBT groups find themselves either alienated or treated as exotic or in those ways. So within our own community, that is part of what occurs in terms of the prejudice. The second aspect, I'm not sure, were you asking me how much LGBTs are prejudiced toward heterosexuals? Was that your question at all? Because
yes, I'm very
Okay.
interested in
Okay.
prejudice in general.
Well, let me answer it this way. I think that the heterosexuals still got, if I had to bet my money, I think there's a lot more prejudice coming at us and going at us like any minority group. The difference is we recognize it coming at us, and you don't always recognize it may be coming at you. That's one way to answer it. The second way to answer it is that I think that situations like this, the best example I can give you is my class, which I affectionately call Dyke Psych, always has mixed sexual orientation and gender and a lot of other mixes, but I'll talk about this one. And one of the most profound things that happens is that when you finally get heterosexuals and LGBTs talking to each other, the prejudice reduces on both sides. And that more of the prejudice on the LGBT side is just being prepared for the hatred they expect coming from you, rather than we don't hate heterosexuals. We hate the institution of heterosexuality that has been a patriarchal system that has caused us so much distress. And on that note, I will invite you now to totally come out and do whatever else Rosie said.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garnett. And now an award, the 2001 National Multicultural Conference and Summit presents the Dalmas A. Taylor Award for a light that shines eternally, taking on the challenge of change, to Dr. Linda Garnett. In honor of your pioneering leadership, scholarship and aggressive advocacy for the inclusion of persons of color in the central fabric of the mission of higher education and within the field of psychology, presented at the second annual National Multicultural Conference and Summit today. Thank you.